Thank you so much for joining us today.
This is Conversations from the Diaspora with Love, with your sister and your friend Nkiru. And today I'm joined by another one of my great friends, Azubuike Nwadei, and we'll be discussing identity in our community as African Americans, as Nigerian-Americans, as Igbo-Americans, or as Biafrans. But before we get into that, Azu, if you would briefly tell our listeners just a bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. As Nkiru mentioned, my name is Azubuike Nwadei. I am an engineer, husband, renewable energy / sustainability advocate of sorts. I also like to tinker with things from time to time. I like to just, make things. Something else that I do is I am a member of IPOB, which is Indigenous People of Biafra. Indigenous People of Biafra is championing the freedom for the Biafran people from the Nigerian Federation.
Nice. Thank you. So Azu, before we get into, all those other details in the conversation, I wanted to ask you, so how are you feeling? How are you adapting to the craziness that's going on in the world? What has the past month or so been like for you, staying at home and social distancing? Anything particular that you've been working on, I guess, during this free time that we have?
Yeah. I think thankfully, where I live hasn't become a hub for the corona or COVID-19 activity. But where I work, we've taken precautions. At home, my wife and I, we've taken precautions, and it's actually been interesting. I mean, I don't want to be. I don't know how people would take this, but I in my opinion, I feel like my in certain senses, my quality of life has actually improved just because where I live and where I work is a bit of a driving distance. And so now I work from home, and so I can wash my face, throw on my robe, and just jump right in.
Nice.
I can eat lunch as I work. Well, actually, I do that in the office too. But
yeah,
there's a certain measure of convenience that comes from the way things are unfolding now, and I want to say that when this pandemic passes, people will probably start working differently. Not just because they're trying to avoid a disease, but I think I think what this has done is it's opened people's eyes to the fact that we don't necessarily need to be in the office to get work done.
Yeah.
And so it makes our lives a little bit more flexible, which always is good.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I feel like some of the measures they're doing now, as far as sanitation and everything, these things should have been going on, I feel like, well before now. So I'm hoping that with the changes that's coming from this, they will actually stay, not just because of the time being, but
right.
a lot of things that are happening now, they should kind of have been happening anyway, and I hope they continue to be enforced.
Right.
All over.
Like washing your hands. I mean,
yeah, I know.
You're not washing your hands. That's just nasty.
I know. Come on.
Yeah.
So Azu, this is just as an aside, but I read in the news the other day, and I think you and I have discussed this probably, but with all this going on with COVID-19, African leaders, they're forced to confront healthcare systems that they've abandoned for years. So I'm hoping that once again, after all this is over, they will have a rethink and hopefully do what is right to develop their countries instead of developing another man's country. What do you think?
I agree with that 100%. I think that the biggest issue with not just African leaders, I mean, I think it's Black people in general, and this is something that we can all kind of internalize and think about. I forgot where I read this. I think there was an article posted online that says that if for example, if African Americans were a country, they would be the fifth wealthiest country in the world. You know, if
Really?
you base that off of, if you look at people's salaries as contributions to GDP, it'd be the fifth wealthiest country in the world. So what that says to me is that the problem is not capacity. The problem is not poverty and ignorance, even though those things exist. The way that I interpret that data is that what the biggest issue is what happens to the black dollar when it hits our account. You know, what do we do with our money? You know, where does it go? Are we using even a small percentage of our income to kind of tackle issues that exist in our communities? Are we patronizing Black-owned businesses? You know, are we? And the way that this could kind of be applied to the question regarding African leaders is, are they building their infrastructure? Are they building hospitals, schools? Are they, tackling basic issues? You know, for example, in Nigeria, reliable power is still a problem. You know, it's 2020. Electricity was invented in the 1800s, and still it's an issue. You know, but it's what that communicates to me is that there's a failure somewhere. Either the money is not being spent, or when the money is spent, it's being misappropriated. You know, or the people that are working on the projects don't know what they're doing. You know, so it's one of those three things. It may be a combination of those things, but you know, either way, these issues need to be addressed.
I highlighted some of the, I guess you can say, the different hyphenated identities that we have, whether it's African American, Nigerian-American, or do you just go by one? How do you normally identify culturally when people may say, oh, your name is interesting, what are you? Where are you from? How do you typically handle those questions, or how do you identify, I guess?
Yeah, when people ask me where I'm from, I tell them that I come from Biafra. I see myself as a Biafran. I don't, you know, even though I'm in America, even though I've been in America for a while, I don't really see myself as American. You know, but yeah, that's the way that I see myself. But I don't think it's necessarily wrong for other people to take a different approach. You know, there's some people that use, you know, hyphenated identities. They say, oh, I'm Biafran American, or I'm Nigerian American, or I'm African American.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's okay too. I think identity is something that's so personal to people that, you know, it's not something that should be forced, you know, on anyone.
Yeah. And I'm pretty much going to ask this question again, but in a different way. At what point did you, like, have you always seen yourself as a Biafran, or did you ever call yourself Nigerian? I guess when you were younger, or maybe when you, like, when did this kind of change happen? And were you ever ashamed of, I guess, identifying one way or the other, or does it depend on who you're around?
Okay, yeah. So there are multiple questions in there, but okay. So starting from the top of the bottom, I haven't always identified as Biafran. When I was younger, you know, growing up, actually, my dad told us in our family that we were Nigerian.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, just me, you know, kind of using deductive reasoning. I just over time. Well, let me step back for a second. When I was growing up, I actually was ashamed to identify with my African heritage.
Yeah.
By the time I reached high school, that had faded away. You know, I was in a sense, kind of neutral to it. I would tell people that was, that this is what I am, and I didn't really feel anything, or I didn't really think anything about it.
Okay.
And of course, there would be a few people here and there that may make certain comments or jokes, but I never really took any of that seriously. So it never really got underneath the skin. But then eventually, when I went to college, is when I actually started to be proud, of my identity, and I started to actively, kind of, I wouldn't say advertise it, but it wouldn't be something I wasn't neutral.
That was hidden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wasn't neutral to it. I actually liked it. And after I finished my first degree and eventually started working, I think it was at that point where there wasn't something immediate in front of me that was completely occupying all my time. I mean, work was obviously there, work was always there, but I began to really sit back and reflect, and it's in that reflection that I began to really introspect and look particularly at what it means to be African. What's going on in Africa? What's going on in Nigeria? And then it was examining those things that really made me start to look at the Black condition overall. And I came to a conclusion that what we have today as Black people is other people are taking care of us. Other people are showing us charity. Slavery was championed by abolitionists. Most of them were white. The civil rights movement was heavily pushed by many non-Black people. Obviously, it's a justice issue, but the core, even today, the core, I would say, life experience or quality of life of a Black person, it's improved, but there are fundamental issues that are not being addressed. And I think that those issues won't be addressed until we build strong nations. We have to build strong nations, because when we build strong nations, we have a firm foundation on which to start. I actually applaud African Americans for what they've been able to do, even though I think that there's more that they can do. I applaud them for what they've been able to do without having anyone kind of watching their back from home. There's a lot of minority groups that come here, and at home there are banks. There's an entire system, an entire infrastructure that looks out. So, for example, I'll give you the case of an Indian guy that was in Alabama. We talk about Black Lives Matter. This Indian man, he was walking down the street, and a police officer sees him. And I don't know, maybe the police officer has complex with people that have turbans. He saw this guy. The guy was a Sikh, Sikh, and he assumed that the guy was an Arab. Not even saying that if he's an Arab, you have to mistreat someone because they're an Arab. But one thing led to another. He slams the guy on the ground, and something happens to the guy's spine. And shortly after, the Indian government, inquires the U.S. government about this guy, and later on he takes the local police department to court, and he wins his court case and just ends up getting a whole lot of money.
Nice.
Now, the issue is not the money. The issue is, justice and going after those that, violate your rights or violate your personal space. But that also requires, a country that is organized to a certain degree. It requires a nation that is strong. And until we have those things, conditions won't improve for us.
Yeah.
And so realizing that, for me, the logical place to begin was Nigeria. But actually, when you read the history of Nigeria, when you really read it and you really examine it, what you find is that there is something profoundly wrong with that country. What I observed was that it was almost like the Nigerian people were colonizing themselves. And I had to, really reflect on that for some time. Really reflect what is going on, until I realized, well, this thing called Nigeria actually didn't exist until 1914. The British created it. And what is happening now is that the indigenous nations within Nigeria are now clashing with one another. And so Biafra is one of those indigenous nations. And all we're saying really is that we don't want to be a part of this anymore. We really don't want to fight our neighbors. We want everyone to, more or less be good neighbors with one another. But that was how over time, beginning my life as a child, my dad kind of explained to us that, he told us that we were Nigerian, and we never really put much thought into it. But it was only when I examined it that I figured out that no, that's actually not the case. And actually, when I have conversations with my dad these days, and I tell him about Biafra, he says, yeah, what you're saying is true. We need to have a plebiscite. And I think that's what most people think in the back of their minds. But the question is, what are people willing to do to bring about that justice, or to solve that fundamental issue?
So I actually asked this question to one of my friends in another episode. In a few words, what is or where is home for you? Is it where you were born? Is it where you live? Where you grew up? Is it where your family is from? And does this definition of home change depending on where you are in your life? Kind of similar to the question on identity.
Yeah. I think home is all of those things. I think home is partially where you're born, but it's also where you live. It's also where your heart is. I think that's the biggest. Factor is, where is someone's heart? And that's what I meant when I said that. I don't think it's wrong for someone to identify, as whatever they identify, even though I may not agree with it, because people's hearts are in different places. But I think home is all those things. But for me personally, the biggest factor of how I define home is where my heart is.
Yeah. So I guess speaking of home, and I know you've touched on this a little bit, what were some of your experiences growing up in, I guess you would say a Nigerian home, good or bad, that you care to share? And how would you say that your upbringing was maybe different or similar to some of our Black American counterparts?
I think that growing up in an African home in America, there were good things, there were bad things. Nothing is ever perfect, but I think that my parents were wonderful. I think that they were wonderful. The thing that I probably take away the most from my father, I guess what my dad kind of passed down to me without him realizing it, is how to master my finances.
Oh wow, that's beautiful.
That's what my dad taught me, and the saying that he always used is that you should sew your coat according to your size. If you're gonna,
so not do more than you can afford.
Yeah, exactly. If you're gonna buy a car, really look at what your budget is. What is your monthly income? What is your disposable income? What is it going to cost to maintain that car? Things like that. And it really impressed upon me the importance of maintaining that balance between what you obtain through your income, working, and how you spend your money. From my mom, I would say my mom was really she was really the person that was like kind of cheering me along, throughout every step in life. She's the one that kind of gave me, my confidence and was always there encouraging me. So that was what I got from my mother.
Nice. So how often would you say you were exposed to the culture growing up? And did you connect well with other Nigerian or African kids when you were younger?
I did. I think I my parents, one way that they exposed us to the culture was food. Food is the is the go-to. You're living in the African home. You're gonna eat African food. There was no
burgers.
Yeah, no burgers, no debating anything. But I think it wasn't really until I left home that I realized how much I enjoyed that. And when I eventually when I got married, and luckily enough, my wife is also a Biafran, so when she cooks, I enjoy it. So it's always a special treat.
That's awesome. Yeah. Did you guys go to like any? I know when we were growing up, we had like some, I guess you could say, community meetings or functions. Here in the Carolinas, there's an Igbo community group, Igbo community in the Carolinas. They would typically have like New Yam Festival and other like Igbo kind of celebrations. Of course, general birthday parties and other things like that, where all of the members in the community would get together and, they would kind of teach us the culture through that way. Did you have any of that growing up?
Yes. Yeah, we did. Where we lived, there was an organization, and it actually was not just African people, it was also Caribbean too. But nice. I think the beauty of it was that, so much of it just kind of melded together. No one really thought about, what song is playing or what language are they speaking. It was the beautiful things. We would go to these meetings, and of course the adults would have their own special meeting, and the kids would all hang out. We'd play basketball or play video games or just talk. But it was really enjoyable. I think we had plenty of that growing up.
That's actually quite surprising that, we don't see too many situations where different members of the diaspora kind of connect. You have the Africans and the Africans. Like that's really beautiful. I'm happy that you guys were able to kind of have that fellowship. That's interesting. Yeah, and it was a wonderful thing. I mean, we even had African-Americans, join wow,
the organization. It was that much of a big deal. But I think also it was that way because the town where I grew up, I mean, I lived for some time in New York City, but eventually settled on a town in Georgia. And that town was not a big town, you know, and so there, as far as I knew, there was only one African themed organization, period. And so everyone just kind of, if you were Black, you just kind of you knew about that organization. So it was nice.
Wow, that's good. So how were your interactions with American kids growing up? I know you touched on it a little bit, like, you know, a few kids maybe making some remarks. But I'm particularly interested in like how you related with Black American kids. Like, how did you navigate that? Did you ever feel like you had to try to fit in, or and does that in any way affect the way you relate with, let's say, Black Americans or other Americans now as an adult?
Right. Growing up, there definitely was a need to fit in, you know. And I think everyone, if you're African and you're in America, as a child, you know, you go. There's a certain, I want to say, there's almost like a certain process you go through. Everyone goes through in the beginning. You're trying to fit in, you know, and then eventually you kind of assimilate to a certain degree, and you know, you find that middle ground, and you know, that's what I did, and it was enjoyable. Although I think sometimes I probably adopted certain things that I shouldn't adopt. Like, you know, sometimes I would, you know, sometimes students would cheat on exams or
no.
and I would let people cheat off me. Like, I would have the answers, and I would just kind of let them cheat off of me. Other times, I think the you know, there were other things, but there are also good attributes that I adopted from Americans, you know, particularly African Americans.
Nice.
You know, one thing that I picked up was an interest in sports, or an interest in, you know, exercise or physical activity. Like that a lot of the Black American kids, they would go to the weight room in college, or not college, in high school, and I would just, you know, do what I saw them doing, even though, you know, if I told my parents that I was doing that, they'd probably say, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that." You know, so there was good and there was bad, but there was also good.
Okay. Did you ever go through, I guess, this phase of wanting to change your name? Because I know that was a challenge that I went through personally. Like, how like when you introduce yourself to other people, how was it? You know, did they get your name right?
Right.
Did they try to give you nicknames? Right. Like,
yeah. When I first, I think where I started to see some trouble was sixth grade.
Okay.
And I noticed that, you know, teachers would mispronounce my name, but that was a given. But you know, also some of the students would make fun of the name. And I did try to, you know, I went through a phase where I would say, okay, well, let me try to develop a nickname that they can pronounce, or a nickname that they can stomach. And I think by the time I was approaching, the high school graduation, I was getting tired of that.
Exactly.
So yeah, that definitely existed, but I never. I guess you could say a nickname is basically changing your name informally, you know. So that's one way to look at it. But I never wanted to go to the extent of, you know, legally changing my name. I never even thought of that.
Yeah, I think for me, it actually got really bad. I mean, of course, I never went through a process, obviously, but I think I remember, like, probably the middle school years, wanting to, you know, change my name from Nkiru or Nkirika to, like, Nicole. And it's like, that is, I mean, of course, looking back at it now, it's like, that would have been a very terrible decision, because, you know, I love my name. I our Igbo
Yeah.
names and the significance behind them, and the thought that goes into kind of giving these names to your children. And I know, like, one particular experience that I had in middle school, I think around the same time like what you said, 6th grade, there was a girl who was named Nikki, who there was some type of issue going on, and at that time they were calling me Nikki, and somehow I got mixed up in that situation. They thought it was me who started whatever the drama was.
I see. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So pretty much after that moment, I kind of thought to myself as a 11-year-old at that time, yeah, I'm not going to go by this name. I'm going to go by my name, Nkiru.
Beautiful.
So,
Beautiful.
yeah.
Beautiful.
So, I mean, I think unfortunately it takes, I think, was it one actress from, was it Black is the New, Orange is the New Black? Her name is Uzo, I think, right? I remember she said something about, her mom talking about her name, and maybe she wanting to change her name as well as a kid, and her mom saying this very powerful thing, if they can pronounce, Chachowski and these other kinds of names, they can easily pronounce, Uzodinma or Azubuike or Nkiruka or these other names. It just takes, I think for some Americans, unfortunately, whenever something is, I guess you can say, different, it's, I don't know, like there's some type of hesitation, unfortunately, when it comes to saying African names, or if it's like maybe they're trying to be dismissive, or I really don't know what it could be, but it's like you can take the time to learn how to say this person's name, but in the beginning saying, "Oh, I'll just call you," that's not acceptable.
And I even after I eventually got through college and everything, I would meet some people, and one guy even told me, when I told him that, my name's Azubuike, but you can call me Azu, he said, he said, is it okay if I call you Oz? And I said, why on earth would you want to call me Oz? What is the meaning of Oz? Just call me Azu, please, call me Azu.
I know.
But it made me laugh. Like when I got home, I was just like, I can't believe it. I mean, Azu is 3 syllables. This guy's trying to shorten it to 2.
I know. It's ridiculous. And I think that's just like maybe the entitlement of, well, I'll just call you this, or can I call you this? Like, no, the person is telling you what their name is, unless you kind of build some level of, I guess, closeness. But just off the bat saying, "Let me call you this," come on, that's not acceptable. So, I guess kind of on the same topic, growing up, for many of us, we had different challenges, feeling different because of our name, our culture, language, or other things. And it wasn't seen as, in quote, cool to be African. But now we see more people, particularly Black Americans, thankfully, are accepting of our Africanness and want to be part of it. Like we saw with Black Panther, for example, and, all over social media with this, I guess you can say, move towards a stronger African awareness. And I know you mentioned this earlier, but just kind of expound on it a little bit more. When did you realize who you were as an African man, and what did it take for you to start appreciating that fact?
I think I realized who I was as an African man when there wasn't any particular event. I think growing up, I've always been a curious person. If I don't apply my mind to something constructive, I'll apply my mind to anything. So eventually, after I started working, I graduated, I got a job. I finally said, okay, now I'm gonna have some time, have spare time. Let me go back and really examine this African heritage of mine. Where what is it? Where is it? That was when I really began to adopt it as my own. It wasn't just that I just happened to be born somewhere. I was doing research to find out the history of that place that I was born in, and that's how I discovered that I'm actually Biafran.
Nice. So, So I know growing up, like I said, we kind of went through different experiences, and identifying as an African person or whatever. I know for many of us, are millennials now. We're young adults now. Do you think that we kind of, at some point in our life, like I think for you, you said maybe like late high school, college years. Do you think we all kind of go through that phase where, I guess, by virtue of becoming an adult or young adult, you start seeing yourself as, well, this is who I am. I'm proud of who I am. And, or do you think it takes some certain level of you going back and doing that research or doing the work to, discover and appreciate who you are? What do you think really changes in a person's life? And do you think that Black Americans, I guess, wanting to, I guess, be part of the African movement, do you think it's because we ourselves are appreciating our African cultures more, or what do you think kind of served as the catalyst for that, for both groups?
Let's see. Okay, so I think that sometime in the last, I would say, 10 years, maybe 15 years. I mean, in African American culture, there have always been those Black Americans that that adopted the African culture more than others.
Yeah.
I think in the past, those types of people have been satirized and they were almost like a caricature. They're almost caricature.
Yeah.
But I think sometime in the last maybe 15 years, it may be the development or preponderance of companies that specialize in collecting people's DNA and telling them where they come from. I mean, it could be that. But I think that's kind of increased the interest level in African Americans in finding out where they come from, and some of them even go to the extent of visiting the country, which I think is wonderful. And then also, I think Black Panther helped a lot. I think Black Panther kind of projected Africa in a way that was positive. It was very, very positive. I think that's wonderful. The only thing I would say about Black Panther is that I would encourage African Americans to find out which African country you come from, or where your DNA comes from, or where your ancestors came, because Wakanda is great, but unfortunately it's a country that doesn't exist. But there are 55 countries in that African continent, and one of them is where you come from, and you can go there. You can go visit, and they're welcome.
Yeah, I mean, that's very powerful, and I think was it last year? I believe the Ghana Year of Return saw some very significant numbers of Black Americans and other members of the diaspora going back to visit and investing so much money. So I think there definitely is a desire for people to, they want to connect, they want to be part of, that movement, they want to see the motherland, they want to, have that connection, whatever that may mean for them. I just wish that more of our African leaders would, I don't know, take it more seriously, maybe. I don't know how to really phrase that, but do what they can to either invest in the tourism to make their different countries more marketable, or to encourage, the travel, or I don't know, easy access, I guess, into the country. Not easy, but make it a little easier for them to travel.
And we even saw a little bit of that at the end of Black Panther. I mean, I think it's so funny the way these things happen. I don't know who decides the scripts of these movies. I don't know if it was an African person that said, "Let me put this in there," and I hope that people would see But at the end of that movie, Wakanda set up a cultural center in the middle. It was in like Detroit or Brooklyn or somewhere like that. Yeah. I think something like that would go a long way, because what it does is it there are a lot of people that don't necessarily have. I mean, flying just across the Atlantic can cost as much as $2,000. So they might not necessarily have the financial means to do that. But if there's a cultural center here, you can go to that cultural center and you can peruse and see what's interesting to you, and then maybe by that a year or something later, you have the money and you said, okay, now I know what city I'm going to go to. I know exactly where I'm going to go because I went to this cultural center where I found out all this information.
Exactly. And so as we're probably going to break really briefly, we're about to get the 45-minute mark. But I guess before that transition, how do you think we as, I guess, continental Africans, how can we connect with Black Americans? What is the cause of the divide even at this point, and what can we do to kind of stop that? Because I feel like, even after Black Panther, and like I said, with this movement towards wanting to come closer or be connected to Africanness, there's still some level of resistance, I guess you can say, from the continental African side, just because of, the history of being called, African booty scratcher or other kind of demeaning names and kind of condescending behaviors towards, by African Americans towards, continental Africans. So how can we kind of get over this hurt and work together to, just connect and do what we need to do as people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way, I think that the onus in this situation really falls on the Africans, because I think if when we go to our events, or if we have like a wedding or something of the sort, we can invite some of our friends that are African American. We can invite them to come to this party and just kind of listen to the music, observe, taste the food, taste the food.
I know.
Look at the clothing. See, try to identify a particular style that you like, or a particular, color pattern that you like. I think the more of that we do, the more interest, develops within, these friends that we have, or it may not even be them. Maybe they know other people, and they show them pictures. And someone asks, "Oh, wait, where were you? What was going on?" But I think it's really up to us, the Africans, to really, reach out and invite people in.
So last we stopped, we were talking about how we can connect with the African diaspora, different members, how we can, I guess you can say, find a sense of community, because for so long we've been divided, and in my opinion, very much unnecessarily divided. And, we talked about, I guess, different solutions and what we can do, I guess, as Africans to maybe bridge that gap on behalf of our, fellow members of the diaspora.
Right.
So just with that in mind, just to talk a little bit about our childhood again. So I know with me and one of my other good friends, we often tease our parents and maybe the way they do things, some funny things they do, we kind of make fun of it. But now as adults who will, one day start our own families, what are some life lessons that you learned from your childhood that you would want to apply in the raising of your own children? And as well as on the contrary, what are some experiences that you had growing up that you would like to do differently when it comes to your own children?
Right. I think that, one thing that I would definitely impart on my children are the two kind of I guess legacies of sorts that I received from my parents. How to master your finances.
Mm.
Because America is there's a lot of money to be made in America, and if you're careful, you can be making money, but if you're not, you can be losing. You can be the one that's losing money. So it's I think that's something that I would definitely impart onto my children. But I think something else that I would impart onto my children is, also, confidence. Confidence in being African. My parents, they were almost kind of they were powerfully kind of dismissive about that. They were just like, oh, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. They were just like, oh, people are making fun of you because you're young. Get out of our face.
Oh, yeah.
To them, it was almost like, how could you let someone get into your head to that degree? But, if I were to have children, I would actually kind of have that conversation with them that says, hey, look, first of all, you're going to meet people in life that you clash with. You're gonna meet those people. The first thing you want, I would want my children to know, is that don't generalize your experience with just one person or a few people to be the entire group. It's not an American thing. It's not an African American thing. It's those particular people. But then the other thing I would teach them is that, every body wants to belong somewhere, and you have an identity. You have an identity that your parents are actively teaching you about. That's a blessing.
Yeah.
So you want to. You don't want to hide that. You don't want to take. Let me think. In the Bible, they say no one takes a candle and puts it underneath a stone or something.
Yeah.
No one hides a torch. The point of a torch is to create light.
Yeah.
And people to use that light to see and all sorts of things. So. Those are two things that I would pass on to them. But I think something that I probably wouldn't pass along is, I think that sometimes, and it's not every African parent that does this, but sometimes African parents can be a little bit, very formal,
what do you mean?
In the home, everything is so formal. Like, I remember my dad was like, just even something with speaking English, for example. Yeah. If I said, so and so and me are about to play basketball. He's like, this is so and so and I. He was an English, Nazi to that extent. But also in other ways, I think African parents just can tend to be very, very formal in the house, and sometimes that can make it hard for the children to really approach the parents, ask them for advice or involve them in things, So that's one thing that I would probably change.
What could be the cause of that? Like, why do you think that was so important for him to, I guess, correct you when you would make maybe grammatical errors, or like how or why do you think he needed to address that?
He probably noticed that we emigrated here from another part of the world, and he wants to make sure that we can I wouldn't say fit in, but he wants to make sure that we can be properly adjusted. Sometimes later in life, like people will have, and I know this sounds terrible, but it's the reality of being a foreigner. It's, sometimes people can do things that creates unnecessary hardship for foreign people, but it's not because what they're doing is bad or destructive. It's just because they don't like. Americans in particular have a hard time adjusting to living around foreign people, working around foreign people.
Yeah.
I've seen situations where sometimes there are, for example, employees that have maybe they recently emigrated, and so their English is not so good, and when people are getting laid off, they lay those people off, and this is an unfortunate thing that happens a lot, not just in America, but just in general across the world. People are much less likely people are much more likely to it's much easier for you to relate to people if you, for example, are speaking their language correctly, or something of the sort. And so I think he was just trying to make sure that we were set up so that we know how to communicate and navigate the system more or less.
Okay, I mean, that definitely makes sense. Did he ever make you feel, maybe him or your mom, did they ever kind of make you feel, well, you are African and you're not an African American, you're not like, was there any kind of, I guess you can say, maybe separation, maybe possibly taught in the home, or how did they kind of talk to you about African Americans, for example?
Sometimes they did. I think when we first arrived, they kind of spoke a little bit more protective. They didn't want us, hanging out with certain people or things like that. But I think as we got older and as they noticed that, okay, they're not doing anything crazy, we know that they're not gonna, I'm not gonna get a phone call that my son is doing this crazy thing. Then they were just like, whoever they bring home, I'm okay, just relating to everybody. And I think that was, I actually think that was their default position. But they wanted to make sure that we just got here from wherever. Yeah, you ain't gonna get into criminal behavior or anything like that. That was what they were really concerned about.
Okay. So I guess to bring it back full circle, how different do you think that your life, or how different do you think or hope that your children's lives will be in comparison to yours? And what is the hope that you have for them as it relates to their views of home or identity or whatever?
I'm sorry, repeat that question.
Yes, I was saying, how different, I guess, do you think or do you hope that your future children's lives will be in comparison to your own, your own experiences growing up and everything here?
Right.
And what is the hope that you have for them as it relates to their views of, whatever home may be or their identity may be?
Yeah. Well, the way that I would like for the lives of my children to be different, I want my children to definitely grow up speaking, Igbo at home.
Yeah.
I'm an Igbo guy. My dad's Igbo. I would like for my children to grow up speaking that language.
Yeah.
My dad spoke it. Unfortunately, we just were not able to learn it. I think the style of learning that is most effective with me is the formal stuff. And,
okay.
I don't have access to really good textbooks. I didn't have access then. And still, the textbooks that are available now really aren't that good. But it's definitely something that I will make happen, because I want my children to speak our language, even if they're not hearing it right from the time that the children are born. They learn it later.
Yeah,
it's something that I will be very active in making sure it happens.
Exactly. So, bro, I guess before we get into our next segment, you touched on the topic that I think many of us, particularly Igbo people in the diaspora, we kind of find ourselves in a very similar situation. I feel like a great majority of us, we just don't know the language, and it's weird, because I was, from my experience in particular, my dad, my mom, they both spoke Igbo in the house like all the time. My dad also made us, like, we were very much aware of who we were as people. Our relation with, the Black American.
I definitely know that was the case with your dad from the book that I read. There's no way. Yeah,
exactly. So it's kind of strange because, like I said, we were exposed to the culture. We, we spoke, my dad and my mom, they spoke it all the time. Of course, like you said, my dad, who he was and, what he stood for and everything else. Again, we're going to talk about this later. He was a very big proponent of, Biafra and everything. But it's just, I don't know what caused the disconnect. Why did we not grasp the language? Like, what do you think, what was the reason for that? Especially for those who maybe heard the language being spoken at home. Why do you think we just didn't grasp it? Did our parents not enforce it enough? Or, I don't know.
I think that it was a combination of two things. The parents, one is, and I keep going back to this because, I learned English in school.
Yes.
I learned it in school. I read it in a book. I did assignments. I was graded on those assignments. Exactly. I learned English that way. And now I would say I'm very, very comfortable in that language.
Yeah.
I think formal instruction was what was missing.
Okay.
I think formal instruction was what was missing because our parents, but one could always make the argument that the same pressures that African families are bearing down on all immigrant populations. Latinos don't have the problem that we have. Jews don't have the problem we have. Jews go to the extent of setting up entire school systems.
Yeah.
You go into the school system, by the time you come out, you're writing essays in Hebrew. But I think we can do those things. But it takes a level of organization. It takes a degree of motivation and organization that can only come from us. No one's going to do it for us. But I think the other factor besides, not having formal learning was just that our parents came here from other countries and they were under such a pressure to themselves, fit in and make sure that they are understanding the language spoken here and the system here. That it just kind of fell by the wayside. But when I was growing up, I heard my dad would speak Igbo to my grandmother, and my mother, even my mother would speak, but and we tried some time to learn the language, but it it didn't stick. You know? But I always knew in the back of my mind, man, if I had a good textbook, I could really learn this thing. You know? I learned Japanese. I mean, in Kuru, you learn Chinese. You know?
Yeah.
So if we can learn those languages, you know, our language is no exception to that rule.
I agree. I think the bottom line, there has to be some level of, I guess you can say, intentionality when it comes to studying the language. Like, we can't just maybe look at an app once in a while or look at a book once in a while. It has to be a very consistent, you know, reviewing 30 minutes or so every day, like actively speaking the language, trying to use, even if you're going to use Igbo, you know, English and Igbo together.
Right.
Like, it's better than nothing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And something else that we have to do, as we learn, we have to introduce the use of what we've learned in the language into just daily interaction at home.
Yeah.
You know, that will go a long way.
Yeah, that is true. And I think the other thing that, you know, we'll kind of wrap up on this topic really quickly. I find it surprising that for those back home, some of them also don't speak the or don't understand it. I'm like, to me, that's more surprising.
Yeah.
At least you're in a place where, you know, you hear it more often, and it's I guess you can say indigenous to that land. Here, I would say we have a somewhat, not really an excuse, but it's a different environment. So I don't know what could be the excuse for those of our brothers and sisters back home, but hey, what's up, my good people? How's it going out there? Once again, my friends and family, it's been wonderful. Please stay tuned for the bonus episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and let's continue the conversation. Please leave me a voice message at anchor.fm/building Africa's future /message. That is anchor.fm/building BLDG Africa's future /message. Please subscribe, share, and contact us on Instagram and Facebook at Building Africa's Future, or by email, buildingafricasfuture@gmail.com. And we've just created a YouTube page, so you can also find us on there as well. More details to come on that. If you enjoyed our work so far and would like to contribute, my Cash App is $Nkiruobi. That is NKIRUOBI. Thank you all so much for joining this conversation. And until next time, please stay well. Bye.
Oh, thank you.